Every night at exactly 11:17, the white K9 returned to a grave that had no name. By the time anyone noticed the pattern, autumn had already settled over the small veterans cemetery outside Jacksonville, North Carolina. The evenings came early there. Fog slipped between the headstones, low and pale, while damp pine needles softened every footstep beneath the old live oaks. Beyond the iron fence, traffic moved along the highway in a distant hush, but inside the cemetery, the world seemed to hold its breath. Martha Bell, the 64-year-old groundskeeper, first saw the dog on a Tuesday night while locking the maintenance shed. He stood nearly 30 yards away, bright against the darkness, a full-grown German shepherd with a coat as white as winter ash. He was not wandering. He was not searching for food. He stood over a fresh mound of earth near the far boundary, his head lowered and his ears pointed forward, as if listening for someone beneath the soil. Martha called softly, but the dog did not turn. She took a few careful steps closer. The cold air carried the scent of wet grass, cedar, and newly turned earth. "Easy boy," she whispered. "You lost." The dog lifted his head then. His amber eyes found hers, calm but guarded. Around his neck hung an old brown leather collar, darkened by rain and age. A metal clasp rested beneath his throat, worn smooth by years of use. He gave no bark, no warning. He simply placed one white paw on the edge of the grave and looked back down. Martha had worked among grieving families for nearly 20 years. She knew what sorrow looked like in human faces. That night, she saw it in a dog. The grave belonged to no family anyone could find. The marker was temporary, a small government-issued plaque bearing only the words "Unknown Veteran 417." 6 months earlier, a man had been found outside town with no identification and no living relatives listed in any database. The county had arranged a quiet military burial. 3 officials attended. A chaplain spoke his prayers into the wind. No one cried. No one placed flowers. Yet now this white K9 stood over him like a sentry who had finally reached his post. Martha left a bowl of water near the grave and went home. By dawn, both the dog and the water were gone. The next night, he returned. 11:17. The night after that, the same. Rain soaked his coat. Wind bent the cemetery flags against their poles. Still he came. He would circle the grave once, lower himself beside it, and remain there until the first gray light touched the eastern sky. Animal control tried to approach him on the 4th night, but he slipped soundlessly through the headstones and vanished beyond the fence. The following evening, he was back. Martha stopped calling authorities after that. Instead, she began leaving water beneath the oak tree and an old wool blanket near the marker. He drank when no one watched. He never touched the blanket. A week passed. Then 2. Stories spread through town about the white dog guarding the nameless Marine. Some said he was a stray. Others said he belonged to the dead man. Martha believed only what she could see. The dog was waiting, and whatever he waited for had not yet happened. On the 17th night, a cold rain swept in from the coast. Martha was closing the cemetery gates when she noticed a truck parked across the road, an older black Ford with North Carolina plates. A man stood beside it beneath the yellow glow of a street lamp. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and still in the quiet way of men who had learned not to waste movement. His name was Staff Sergeant Isaiah Cole, though he had not worn the uniform in nearly 4 years. His dark skin shone with rain, and a thin scar crossed his right temple. He had come to the cemetery because sleep had failed him again, and walking among the names of the dead sometimes felt easier than sitting alone with the ones he remembered. Then he saw the dog. White coat, straight back, one paw resting beside the unmarked grave. Isaiah stopped breathing. The rain tapped softly against the brim of his cap. For a moment, he was no longer 38 years old, standing in North Carolina. He was 28 again, beneath a hard foreign sun, hearing a familiar bark outside a canvas tent. The dog turned toward him. Something metal flashed beneath his throat. Isaiah stepped through the gate. Slowly, afraid that one sudden movement might break whatever fragile thing had crossed 10 years to find him. He came within 15 feet before he saw the scratches on the clasp. 3 diagonal lines. 2 faded initials. DM. His knees nearly gave way. "That collar," he whispered. The dog's ears rose. Isaiah stared into those amber eyes and spoke a name he had buried long before any grave could hold it. Ghost. The white K9 did not run to him. He did not wag his tail. He looked at Isaiah for one long, aching second, then turned back toward the nameless grave. Isaiah did not move closer. The white shepherd held his gaze for another moment, then lowered his head toward the grave as if the name Isaiah had spoken belonged to the earth now. Rain gathered along the dog's whiskers and slipped from the edge of the old collar. Martha stood several yards behind Isaiah, one hand resting against the iron gate, afraid that even her breathing might disturb what was happening. "You know him?" she asked softly. Isaiah kept his eyes on the dog. "I knew a dog with that name." His voice sounded distant, almost borrowed. 10 years ago. Ghost's right ear twitched. It was a small movement, easy to miss, but Isaiah saw it. He had once watched those ears read a room before any Marine inside understood there was danger. He remembered the way Ghost would tilt his head when someone spoke Daniel's name, and how the dog would sit beside the supply tent every evening at 6, waiting for a hand signal no one else used. Isaiah slowly removed his cap. Rain touched the close-cropped hair along his temples. "Easy, Marine," he murmured, using the words Daniel had always spoken when Ghost became restless. The shepherd lifted his head again. His body remained still, but his eyes changed. The guarded distance inside them softened for less than a second, then returned. Isaiah took one careful step. Ghost rose immediately. Not threatening, not afraid. Ready. His shoulders tightened beneath the wet white fur, and his tail lowered in a straight line behind him. Isaiah stopped. "All right," he said. "I hear you." Martha watched the exchange with quiet wonder. She had never seen the dog obey anyone. Yet this was not obedience. It was recognition held back by caution, like a door opening only an inch. Isaiah crouched where he stood, making himself smaller. From that angle, the metal clasp beneath Ghost's throat caught the cemetery light again. 3 diagonal marks had been carved into it by hand. Below them, nearly erased by years of weather, were the letters D and M, Daniel Mercer. Isaiah could see Daniel sitting on an overturned ammunition crate, turning a scrap of brass between his fingers while Ghost rested at his boots. Daniel had laughed when Isaiah asked why he was wasting time decorating a dog collar. "Because government equipment has no soul," Daniel had said. "A partner should carry something made by the man who trusts him." Together, they had filed the metal smooth. Daniel carved the lines. Isaiah stamped the initials. On the inside, Daniel scratched 2 words with the tip of a field knife. "Never leave." Isaiah had not thought about that afternoon in years. Now the memory returned with the smell of canvas, dust, machine oil, and bitter coffee warmed too many times. He lowered his eyes, unable to look at Ghost for a moment. "That collar was made overseas," he told Martha. "There is no other one like it." Martha stepped closer, stopping beside a stone marker. "Then it is him?" Isaiah wanted to say yes. Every part of him wanted certainty. But 10 years could change an animal. White German shepherds were rare, not impossible. Scars could resemble scars. Memory could build bridges where none existed. Still, the collar could not be explained away. Ghost was listed as missing, Isaiah said. Daniel was with him. He looked toward the temporary plaque. Unknown veteran 417 shone beneath a thin sheet of rain. Neither one was ever brought home. At the sound of Daniel's name, Ghost turned his face toward Isaiah again. This time, a faint sound left his throat. Not a growl, not quite a whine. It was low and broken, as though it had traveled through too many empty years. Isaiah felt the sound settle inside his chest. "Daniel," he repeated. Ghost took one step toward him, then stopped. His nose lifted, testing the wet air between them. Isaiah remained motionless. The dog came another foot closer, careful and silent, until only a few yards remained. Then a truck passed on the highway, tires hissing across rain-dark pavement. Ghost flinched and moved back to the grave. He placed himself between Isaiah and the mound of earth, guarding it. Isaiah understood. Whatever the dog remembered, trust had not yet caught up. Martha pulled her coat tighter around her. "He comes here every night," she said. "Always at the same time. He stays until sunrise." Isaiah studied the white shepherd, the worn collar, and the nameless marker behind him. "How long?" 17 nights. "And no one knows where he goes during the day?" Martha shook her head. "He disappears before the gates open." Isaiah looked down at his watch. 11:43. The rain had begun to ease, leaving only a soft tapping in the oak branches. Ghost settled beside the grave again, but his eyes remained on Isaiah. "I am not taking you from him," Isaiah said. "Not tonight." He lowered himself onto the wet grass 15 feet away. The cold entered through his jeans almost immediately, but he did not move. Martha watched him sit in silence, facing the dog across the unmarked grave. "You plan to stay?" she asked. Isaiah placed his cap beside him. He stood watch alone for 17 nights. Ghost's ears shifted toward his voice. Isaiah looked at the old initials beneath the dog's throat and felt 10 years of certainty begin to crack. He will not stand the 18th alone. The rain ended sometime after midnight, leaving the cemetery wrapped in a silence so complete that Isaiah could hear water slipping from the oak, leaves one drop at a time. Ghost remained beside the grave, his white coat darkened along the back, his breathing slow and steady. Isaiah sat on the wet grass with his hands resting loosely over his knees. He did not try to call the dog again. Trust, he had learned, could not be ordered back into existence. It had to be given room. Hours passed that way, two old soldiers facing the same mound of earth from opposite sides. Martha eventually brought Isaiah a blanket and a paper cup of coffee from the maintenance office. She placed both beside him. Without speaking, the coffee smelled burnt and familiar, the kind served in ready rooms before dawn, and for one painful second Isaiah could almost hear Daniel complaining about it. Daniel Mercer had hated weak coffee, quiet rooms, and men who pretended they were fine. He had possessed an easy smile that could soften the hardest morning, and a way of noticing grief before the person carrying it was ready to admit it. Isaiah had met him 12 years earlier at a training facility in California, when both men were younger and still believed that discipline could protect them from every kind of loss. Daniel was already partnered with Ghost then, a lean white shepherd barely 2 years old, sharp-eyed and restless, with paws too large for the rest of him. Ghost had ignored nearly everyone during those first weeks. He watched. He measured. He decided for himself who was worth trusting. Daniel never forced the bond. He sat beside the kennel each evening and read letters from home aloud. Not because Ghost understood every word, but because Daniel believed a voice could become a shelter. "You cannot demand loyalty," he once told Isaiah. "You build a place where it wants to stay." Isaiah had laughed at the time. Years later, those words would return whenever the nights grew too long. During deployment, the three of them became an unlikely family. Daniel carried patience. Ghost carried instinct. Isaiah carried silence, though he did not know it yet. After a difficult mission left Isaiah hollow and withdrawn, he began avoiding the dining tent and sleeping in short, uneasy stretches. No one confronted him. Marines often respected pain by pretending not to see it. Daniel did the opposite. He placed a folding chair outside Isaiah's tent and sat there every evening without invitation. Ghost lay across the entrance, his white body curved like a living barrier. They did not ask Isaiah to talk. They simply refused to let him disappear. Some nights, Daniel told ridiculous stories about fishing with his father near Lake Erie. Other nights, he said nothing at all. Ghost would rest his chin on Isaiah's boot and remain there until morning. That quiet companionship had saved something inside Isaiah that medicine and official reports could not reach. Yet when Daniel and Ghost vanished during a chaotic evacuation 2 years later, Isaiah had failed to return the same gift. He had searched for 6 days. 6 days through broken communications, conflicting coordinates, and reports that changed by the hour. On the 7th day, command ordered the team to withdraw. Isaiah argued until his voice broke. Then he signed the report. Missing. Presumed lost. 2 words for a man who had sat outside his tent. 2 words for a dog who had guarded his sleep. Isaiah had carried the shame of that signature across every state line since. At 3 in the morning, Ghost shifted. His head lifted, and his eyes settled on Isaiah. The dog stood, stretched his stiff legs, and walked slowly around the grave. Isaiah held still. Ghost stopped at the foot of the mound, lowered his nose to the soil, then moved toward the temporary marker. He began scraping gently beside it, not with panic, but with purpose. Martha, watching from the office window, stepped outside with a flashlight. "He has done that before," she whispered. Isaiah rose carefully. Ghost paused, but did not retreat. Beneath a thin layer of damp earth, something dark appeared. A strip of weathered leather, no longer than 6 inches. Ghost caught it between his teeth and pulled it free. Attached to the end was a small brass ring. Isaiah recognized it immediately. It was part of a military working dog lead, the same kind Daniel had clipped to Ghost's collar before every patrol. Isaiah moved one step closer. Where did you get that? Ghost turned his head toward the grave. The answer was clear enough to chill Isaiah more deeply than the cold. The lead had been buried with the unknown man. Someone had placed it in his pocket or in his hand before the casket was closed. Isaiah looked at the nameless marker, then at Ghost. A possibility he had been afraid to name now stood between them. If the man beneath that soil had carried Ghost's lead, then the collar was not the only thing that had crossed 10 lost years. Isaiah knelt, leaving several feet of space between himself and the dog. You found him, did you not? His voice trembled. Ghost approached just close enough to place the leather strip on the grass. Then he looked directly into Isaiah's eyes. For the first time that night, he gave a single quiet bark. Not a warning, an answer. The bark faded into the wet darkness, but Isaiah felt it remain inside him. Ghost lowered his head and nudged the strip of leather across the grass until it touched Isaiah's knee. The brass ring was cold in his palm. A shallow mark crossed one side, made years ago when Daniel had dropped the lead beside a field stove and laughed while Isaiah teased him for treating government equipment like a family heirloom. There could be no mistake now. This piece had belonged to Ghost, and somehow it had gone into the ground with the unknown man. Martha stood several feet away, the flashlight trembling slightly in her hand. Could it have been buried near the surface by accident? She asked. Isaiah turned the ring beneath the beam. Damp soil filled its smallest grooves. No, he said quietly. This was attached to something before the burial. Martha looked toward the temporary marker. Then we need the records. Dawn arrived slowly, whitening the sky beyond the pines and turning the wet headstones silver. Ghost remained beside the grave while Isaiah followed Martha into the cemetery office, a narrow brick building warmed by an old electric heater. The room smelled of paper, dust, and coffee that had been sitting too long. Martha unlocked a metal cabinet and removed a thin gray folder marked with the number 417. There was less inside than Isaiah expected. A county intake form, a hospital notice, a burial authorization, no family contact, no confirmed name. No photograph from before the man's death. He had been found 6 months earlier near an abandoned freight platform outside Jacksonville, wearing a dark green jacket and carrying no wallet. A passerby had called for help after seeing him seated beneath the station awning in the rain. He had been taken to the hospital, but his condition had been too weak for long conversation. According to the notes, he remembered only fragments. A first name that might have been David. A lake. A white dog. The word home. Isaiah read that line twice. Then a third time. Was anything found with him, he asked. Martha opened a smaller envelope clipped to the back of the folder. Personal effects were transferred before the burial. Most are stored with the county. She paused. But they included copies. She placed 3 photographs on the desk. The first showed a weathered Marine Corps Challenge coin. The second showed a folded length of dog lead, dark brown and frayed at one end. The third showed a small photograph damaged by water. Isaiah picked it up with both hands. The edges were softened and pale. A tear ran through the center, removing part of one figure, but the image was still clear enough. 2 Marines stood beside a young white German shepherd under the shade of a canvas shelter. One man was Daniel Mercer. The other was Isaiah Cole. For several seconds, Isaiah heard nothing. Not the heater, not Martha's breathing, not the clock above the cabinet. He remembered the day the photograph had been taken. The sun had been brutal, and Daniel had complained that Ghost looked more professional than either of them. Isaiah had laughed just before the camera clicked. It was one of the last photographs they had together. He had believed every copy was gone. That is you, Martha whispered. Isaiah nodded, though the movement barely came. And that is Daniel. He touched the damaged side of the picture where Daniel's shoulder remained beneath the torn paper. The man I told you about. Outside the office window, Ghost stood facing the building. He had not returned to the grave. He was watching Isaiah now. Martha studied the intake report. The hospital listed the man as approximately 50 years old. Daniel would have been 49. Height was 6 feet, 1 inch. Isaiah closed his eyes. That was his height. The evidence gathered around him like a tide, each piece small enough to doubt on its own, but together too heavy to ignore. Still, proof mattered. Names mattered. Daniel had already been lost once inside a report. Isaiah would not let hope erase caution. Who handled the burial? he asked. Martha turned to the final page. A county veterans liaison named Rebecca Sloan. She tried to identify him for 3 months. Fingerprints were inconclusive because of old damage and incomplete records. Dental comparisons returned nothing. Was any sample kept? The hospital may have one. Isaiah reached for his phone, then stopped. Through the glass, Ghost suddenly turned toward the cemetery road. His ears lifted. A white county vehicle had pulled beyond the gate. A woman stepped out carrying a document case. Martha frowned. That is Rebecca. Isaiah looked back at the photograph in his hand. Rebecca Sloan entered moments later, bringing with her the scent of cold air and rain. She was in her early 50s, with gray threaded through her dark hair and the steady expression of someone accustomed to delivering difficult truths. Martha said there was a question about grave 417, she began. Then she saw Isaiah. Her eyes moved to the photograph. Staff Sergeant Cole? Isaiah stood. You know me? Rebecca placed the document case on the desk. I know your face. She opened the case and removed an old sheet of paper sealed inside a protective sleeve. The unknown veteran wrote your name before he passed. We searched military databases, but there were too many Isaiah Coles and no complete service number. The handwriting was faint, uneven, but still legible. Isaiah Cole. Beneath it were 3 more words. Watch my 6. Isaiah stared at the phrase Daniel had used 1,000 times. Outside, Ghost gave one soft whine. Rebecca lowered her voice. There is something else. The hospital preserved a blood sample. Yesterday, after Martha reported the dog, I requested a new comparison against missing service members. Isaiah looked toward Ghost, then toward the nameless grave beyond him. And Rebecca held his gaze. The result came back this morning. Rebecca drew a slow breath before answering. The sample is consistent with Gunnery Sergeant Daniel Mercer's archived medical profile, but it is not enough for a final legal identification. Isaiah felt hope rise and stop halfway, caught between relief and fear. What does that mean? It means the markers match where records still exist, Rebecca said. But the military file is incomplete. We need one more confirming source before the county can change the grave record. Martha looked toward the window. Ghost had returned to the mound, his white shape almost motionless in the gray morning. Isaiah folded the damaged photograph carefully and placed it back on the desk. Then we find it. Rebecca nodded toward the dog. He may be part of the answer. By mid-morning, they had arranged for Ghost to be examined at Carter Veterinary Clinic, a small practice 6 miles from the cemetery. Isaiah drove behind Martha's truck while Ghost rode in the back seat, not lying down, not looking around, only watching the road through the rear window as the cemetery disappeared behind them. Every mile seemed to pull tension through his body. His paws shifted on the seat. His breath came faster. Isaiah kept one hand near the center console, but did not reach back. We are coming back, he said. Ghost's ears moved toward the sound, but his eyes stayed fixed on the road behind them. Dr. Emily Carter met them at the clinic entrance. She was a calm woman in her early 40s with dark hair tied low and a voice that never hurried frightened animals. She led Ghost into a quiet examination room away from barking dogs and ringing telephones. The room smelled of antiseptic, clean towels, and the faint cedar scent of the calming spray used along the walls. Ghost stood near the door, alert but controlled. Emily scanned his neck and shoulders twice before the device gave a weak chirp. There is a chip, she said. Older military type and damaged. She adjusted the scanner. A partial identification number appeared, followed by corrupted characters. Isaiah leaned closer. The first 4 digits were enough. He remembered them from training records he had reviewed years ago. That sequence belonged to our unit. Emily looked at him. So this dog served? Yes, Isaiah said. If he is who I think he is. She examined the faded scar above Ghost's left eye and the thickened skin beneath his collar. He has the posture of a working dog. He is also older than he looks. 8 or 9, perhaps more. Ghost would be 12. Emily studied the shepherd again. Hard years can change the way age shows. She offered him water. Ghost drank only after Isaiah stepped away from the bowl. Then he returned to the door and stared toward the parking lot. Martha watched from the corner. He thinks we took him away from the grave. Isaiah felt the truth of it. Ghost had allowed them to move him, but permission was not trust. He crouched several feet away. Ghost, he called softly. The dog did not look at him. Isaiah tried again. using the name printed on the county shelter notice prepared after the first sighting. Winter. One ear turned, but Ghost faced the door. Emily glanced at Isaiah. Maybe neither name feels safe to him anymore. Isaiah remembered Daniel teaching young Marines that commands were not magic words. They worked because history lived behind them. He searched his memory for something untouched by official manuals. Daniel had used a private phrase whenever he needed Ghost to move behind him and guard the space no human eyes could cover. It had begun as training, then became habit, almost a promise between them. Isaiah stood slowly and turned his back to the dog. His throat tightened before he spoke. "Watch my 6." For one heartbeat, nothing happened. Then claws clicked softly across the floor. Ghost left the door, walked around Isaiah, and sat directly behind his right leg. His chest aligned with Isaiah's back. His head lifted. His eyes swept the room. "Ready." Martha covered her mouth. Emily lowered the scanner. Isaiah closed his eyes. 10 years fell away in the space of one command. He could hear Daniel laughing under the canvas shelter. He could feel desert heat against his face. He could remember Ghost taking that same position before every patrol, trusting the man in front of him to lead and the man beside him to return. Isaiah turned slowly. Ghost remained seated. "You remember that," he whispered. The dog looked up, and for the first time there was no distance in his eyes, only exhaustion and something fragile beneath it. Isaiah extended his hand, palm down. Ghost leaned forward, touched his nose to Isaiah's fingers, then drew back. It lasted less than a second. It was enough. Emily checked the chip again while Ghost stayed near Isaiah. This time the scanner held the signal longer. A line of data appeared beneath the damaged number. MWDG. Then a service designation. Then one name, incomplete but unmistakable. Ghost. Isaiah looked toward Martha, but before either could speak, Ghost rose suddenly and began pacing toward the exit. His breathing sharpened. He pressed his nose against the seam beneath the door and gave a low, urgent whine. Isaiah understood before anyone explained it. Recognition had not changed the dog's mission. The grave was still unguarded. "All right," Isaiah said, reaching for the old leather collar without touching it. "We are going back." Ghost stopped pacing. Isaiah met his eyes. "But this time, you are not going alone." Ghost returned to the cemetery before noon, moving through the gate with a purpose that made the others follow without speaking. The clouds had lifted, but the ground still shone with rain, and the air carried the clean scent of pine, wet stone, and cold earth. He crossed the rows of markers without hesitation and stopped at grave 417. Only then did his breathing slow. He circled once, lowered himself beside the mound, and rested his chin on his front paws. Isaiah stood a few feet away, watching the dog settle as though an invisible weight had been placed back where it belonged. Rebecca opened her document case on the hood of the county vehicle. "The partial chip record gives us a unit number," she said. "I sent it to a contact at the military working dog program. We may be able to reconstruct his transfer history." Isaiah looked down at Ghost. There was no transfer history. He vanished with Daniel. "Officially," Rebecca replied. The word landed softly, but it carried enough weight to turn Isaiah toward her. Rebecca removed a photocopied hospital intake form from the case. After the blood comparison came back, I checked regional records under the name David Miller. That was the first name the unknown veteran remembered when he arrived at the hospital. She traced one line with her finger. A man using that name appeared in a relief clinic database 9 years ago. He was treated for dehydration, confusion, and long-term memory loss. A white German shepherd was with him. Isaiah stared at the page. "Where?" "A temporary clinic near a military transit route overseas. The record is brief. No identification. No permanent address. The man left before officials could determine who he was." Martha shook her head. "So Daniel survived." "It appears he did," Rebecca said. "But he may not have known he was Daniel." The cemetery seemed to grow quieter around them. Isaiah imagined his friend waking each morning with no clear map back to himself, carrying only fragments. A lake, a white dog, a name that was not his. Ghost lifted his head at the sound of Daniel's name, then looked toward Isaiah. Rebecca continued. 3 years later, David Miller appears again in a charitable housing program in Virginia. The notes mention that he worked small maintenance jobs and refused to enter shelters unless the dog could stay with him. "That sounds like Daniel," Isaiah whispered. Daniel had once slept outside a supply building rather than place Ghost in a distant kennel during a storm. Rules mattered to him, but loyalty mattered more. The program closed, Rebecca said. After that, the records become scattered. A bus ticket under the same name. A meal assistance form. A clinic visit in Tennessee. Then nothing for almost 2 years. Isaiah looked at the unknown marker. How did he end up here? Rebecca turned to another page. 3 months before he died, a church outreach volunteer met him near Wilmington. He was traveling north with Ghost. He told her they were looking for someone named Isaiah. The cold entered Isaiah slowly, though the sun had begun to warm the stones. He remembered me. Maybe only the name, Rebecca said gently. The volunteer wrote that he carried an old photograph and asked whether Camp Lejeune was close. Isaiah lowered his head. Camp Lejeune was less than 20 miles from where they stood. Daniel had come almost all the way back. Why did he not reach the base? Martha asked. There was a coastal storm that week, Rebecca answered. Roads closed. The shelter where he stayed moved guests to another county. During the transfer, Daniel was taken by ambulance after becoming ill. Ghost was not allowed inside the vehicle. Isaiah's jaw tightened, not in anger at any one person, but at the simple cruelty of circumstances. One door, one rule, one moment of separation after years of surviving together. Rebecca's voice softened. The shelter staff tried to hold Ghost, but he escaped that same night. Daniel was moved twice between medical facilities. By the time anyone searched for the dog, he was gone. Ghost had risen now. He stood over the grave, ears forward, as if hearing the story through something deeper than words. Isaiah knelt beside the temporary marker. He lost Daniel once during the evacuation, he said. Then he lost him again here. Rebecca nodded. But this time he found him. Martha looked toward the road. How? No one answered immediately. The wind moved gently through the flags, and somewhere beyond the fence, a church bell marked the hour. Isaiah studied Ghost's old collar, the worn leather polished by weather and years of touch. Scent, he said at last. Memory. Maybe the hospital returned Daniel's jacket with the body. Maybe Ghost followed the transport route. Maybe he searched every place Daniel had been. He reached into his coat and removed the strip of dog lead. Ghost watched it closely. Or maybe he followed the one promise Daniel taught him never to break. Rebecca closed the folder. There is one more lead. The military working dog program located an archived service packet connected to Ghost's chip. It was sealed after the unit was reorganized. Isaiah stood. What is in it? Training history, medical records, handler designation. She paused. And possibly a registered emergency contact for Daniel. Family. No, Rebecca said. Another Marine. Isaiah understood before she said the name. The answer was already waiting in the damaged photograph, in the note beside Daniel's hospital bed, and in the 3 words written beneath Isaiah's name. Watch my 6. Rebecca met his eyes. You. Ghost stepped away from the grave and came to Isaiah's side. Not behind him this time. Beside him. For the first time, their shoulders aligned in the same direction. Isaiah looked down at the old K9, and the truth settled with quiet force. Daniel had not spent 10 years wandering without a home. He had spent 10 years trying to return to one. The archived service packet arrived just before sunset, delivered electronically to Rebecca's office, and printed on paper that still felt warm when she carried it across the cemetery. The sky above Jacksonville had cleared to a pale blue, and long shadows stretched between the headstones. Ghost remained beside Isaiah, close enough that the old Marine could feel the dog's quiet presence without looking down. Martha unlocked the maintenance office, and the 4 of them gathered around the narrow desk while the heater clicked against the evening chill. Rebecca opened the packet carefully. The first pages were routine records. Vaccinations, weight checks, training evaluations, deployment dates. Then came the handler designation. Gunnery Sergeant Daniel Mercer. Beneath it was the secondary emergency contact. Staff Sergeant Isaiah Cole. Isaiah read his own name and felt the room tilt around him. Daniel had trusted him with Ghost long before either of them knew how much that trust would cost. Emily arrived from the clinic a few minutes later, carrying a small leather tool case. She had asked to examine the collar again after noticing an unusual thickness beneath the inner lining. Ghost allowed her near only when Isaiah remained at his side. I will not remove it unless you are comfortable, she said. Isaiah looked down at the white shepherd. Easy, Ghost. The dog held still. Emily ran her fingers along the worn leather and found a narrow seam hidden beneath years of dust and weather. It was not part of the original collar. Someone had stitched a second layer over the inside by hand. The thread had darkened almost to black. Daniel did this, Isaiah whispered. He recognized the uneven spacing. Daniel had once repaired his own field gloves with the same stubborn lack of skill. Emily used a small pair of scissors to loosen one end of the seam. Ghost watched every movement, but he did not pull away. When the leather opened, a thin metal shape appeared inside, wrapped in faded cloth. Isaiah's breath caught. Emily placed the object on the desk and unfolded the cloth. It was half of a military identification tag, worn at the edge but still readable. Mercer, Daniel J. Beneath the name was a service number that matched the archived file. No one spoke for several seconds. The heater clicked off, leaving only the faint sound of Ghost breathing. Rebecca leaned closer. This may be enough for the county, especially with the blood comparison. Isaiah touched the edge of the tag with one finger. Why would Daniel hide it in the collar? Emily examined the remaining seam. There is something else. She reached inside and removed a tightly folded piece of paper no larger than a postage stamp. Time had stained it brown. The writing was faint, but Daniel's block letters remained visible. Isaiah unfolded it with hands that had begun to shake. The message contained only 10 words. If I forget who I am, he will remember for me. Martha turned away and pressed her fingers to her lips. Rebecca lowered her eyes. Isaiah read the sentence again, hearing Daniel's voice beneath every word. Somewhere during those lost years, Daniel had understood that his memory was failing. He had placed his name where he believed it would remain safe. Not in a bank, not in an office, not inside a file that could be misplaced. He had entrusted it to Ghost. The dog had carried Daniel's identity through storms, shelters, highways, and towns that never knew either of them. He had guarded the name even when the man himself could no longer speak it. Isaiah looked down. Ghost was staring at the fragment of cloth, his amber eyes steady. Isaiah lowered himself to one knee and held the tag near the dog's collar. You kept it, he said softly. Ghost leaned forward and touched his nose to Isaiah's wrist. This time, he did not retreat. Isaiah placed his other hand gently against the side of the dog's neck. Beneath the white fur, he felt warmth, age, and a heartbeat that had refused to surrender its purpose. I am sorry, Isaiah whispered. I should have found both of you. Ghost closed his eyes for a moment and pressed his head beneath Isaiah's palm. There was no accusation in the gesture, no demand for an explanation, only recognition, only the quiet mercy of being known after years apart. Rebecca stepped into the hallway to call the county medical examiner. Emily began documenting the collar and identification tag. Martha remained near the window, watching evening gather over grave 417. Isaiah stayed on the floor beside Ghost. After a while, he noticed another marking carved into the back of the tag. 3 diagonal lines, the same symbol on the collar clasp. Beneath them was one final word. Home. Isaiah understood then that Daniel had not hidden the tag only to preserve his identity. He had left a direction, a last instruction to the one soul he trusted to complete the journey. Ghost rose and walked toward the office door. Isaiah opened it, and the dog stepped into the fading light. He crossed the cemetery slowly, no longer rushing, until he reached the grave. Then he turned and waited. Isaiah followed with Daniel's tag in his hand. When he reached the mound, Ghost sat beside him and looked toward the blank marker. Isaiah knelt, placed the tag against the temporary plaque, and spoke with a steadiness he had not felt in 10 years. His name is Daniel Mercer. Ghost lowered his head. The wind moved softly through his white coat, and somewhere among the trees, the last light of day touched the wet leaves like a quiet blessing. The grave was still unmarked, but the man beneath it was unknown no longer. By noon the next day, the county had accepted the identification. The blood comparison, the archived service number, the hidden identification tag, and Daniel's handwritten note formed a chain too strong to doubt. Grave 417 would no longer remain under an unknown number. Gunnery Sergeant Daniel James Mercer had come home at last. The news moved quietly through Jacksonville, carried first through veterans groups, then through old unit contacts, until men and women who had not spoken Daniel's name in years began calling Rebecca's office. Some remembered his patience. Some remembered the way he shared coffee even when supplies ran low. Nearly everyone remembered the white German shepherd who never left his side. A memorial service was arranged for Saturday morning. There would be no grand ceremony, only a military honor guard, a chaplain, several former Marines, and the people who had helped restore Daniel's name. Isaiah spent the days before it with Ghost. The dog followed him away from the cemetery for short periods now, though never without looking back toward the far row of stones. Isaiah took him to a quiet house near the New River, where he had lived alone since leaving the service. The rooms were clean but bare, filled with the careful order of a man who owned very little because memories already occupied too much space. Ghost entered slowly. He inspected each doorway, paused beside the couch, then found the front door and lay across it. The same position he had once taken outside Isaiah's tent. That first night, Isaiah sat on the floor beside him while an old photograph rested on the coffee table. Daniel stood in the center, younger than either of them had deserved to be, one hand on Ghost's shoulder and the other around Isaiah's back. "You brought him as far as you could," Isaiah said. Ghost opened his eyes. "I should have been waiting." The dog moved his head onto Isaiah's boot. No answer could have been kinder. Saturday arrived clear and cold. Rows of flags stirred beneath a pale Carolina sky, and the cemetery grass shone with frost. The temporary plaque had been removed. In its place stood a new granite marker covered with a folded cloth. Isaiah wore his Marine dress uniform for the first time in 4 years. The fabric felt tighter across his shoulders, and the medals on his chest seemed to belong to another man. But Ghost recognized the uniform. He rose the moment Isaiah entered the cemetery and walked beside his left leg without a command. His coat had been brushed clean, revealing white fur that gleamed in the morning light. Daniel's restored identification tag hung from the old collar, tapping softly against the brass clasp with each step. Martha stood near the grave holding a small arrangement of white roses. Emily and Rebecca waited beside her. Behind them were 12 former Marines, some gray-haired, some walking with canes, all carrying the stillness of people who understood that remembrance was also a kind of duty. The chaplain began with Daniel's name. At the sound, Ghost lifted his head. Isaiah felt the movement beside him. For 10 years, the dog had carried that name where no record could reach it. Now it moved across open air, clear and whole. Daniel James Mercer. Marine. Handler. Friend. The honor guard folded the flag with deliberate care and presented it to Isaiah, the emergency contact Daniel had chosen long ago. Isaiah accepted it with both hands. His face remained steady until the chaplain spoke of those who continue a mission after hope has grown quiet. Then his eyes lowered toward Ghost. He did not forget, Isaiah said when invited to speak. His voice traveled no farther than necessary. When Daniel lost his memory, Ghost carried it. When Daniel lost his name, Ghost guarded it. When I stopped searching, Ghost did not. The words caught in his throat, but he continued. Daniel once told me that loyalty cannot be demanded. You have to build a place where it wants to stay. He built that place in this dog. He built it in me, too. I only understood too late. Ghost leaned gently against Isaiah's leg. Isaiah placed one hand on the dog's head. I am sorry, brother, he said, looking at the grave. I left the search before the search was over. Wind moved through the flags. No voice answered from beneath the earth. Instead, Ghost stepped forward. He placed one paw against the base of the covered marker and waited. Martha drew away the cloth. The name appeared in dark, carved letters. Gunnery Sergeant Daniel James Mercer, United States Marine Corps. Beneath it was a final line chosen by Isaiah. He was remembered. Ghost stared at the stone. His ears trembled once. Then he lowered his body and rested beside the grave, not with the rigid posture of a sentry, but with the tired ease of an old friend who had finally been relieved. Isaiah knelt next to him. Around them, the service ended in quiet handshakes and lowered heads. One by one, the visitors walked away until only Isaiah and Ghost remained. You can rest now, Isaiah whispered. Ghost looked at the marker, then turned toward him. Slowly, he rose. He took 2 steps to Isaiah's side and sat there, shoulder against knee. He had guarded Daniel through nameless years. Now, for the first time, he chose to face away from the grave. That evening, Martha watched the cemetery gate from the office window. The clock above her desk moved toward 11:17, the hour when Ghost had appeared for 17 nights without fail. Outside, fog gathered low across the grass, softening the new stone until Daniel's name seemed to float in the dark. 11:16 passed. Martha stepped onto the porch and listened. No paws crossed the gravel. No white shape moved between the markers. At 11:17, the cemetery remained still. For the first time, Ghost did not come. 5 miles away, Isaiah sat in the front room of his small house with the lights turned low. Daniel's folded flag rested inside a wooden case on the mantel. The restored photograph stood beside it, no longer torn through the middle. Daniel smiled between Isaiah and a younger Ghost, all three facing a future none of them could see. The old K9 lay near the front door, but not across it. His body was curled on a thick wool blanket Isaiah had placed beside the couch. For several hours, he had fought sleep, lifting his head whenever a car passed or wind touched the porch. Each time, Isaiah spoke the same quiet words. "You are home." At first, Ghost only watched him. Then, slowly his eyes closed. His breathing deepened. The house, empty for so long, began to sound inhabited again. Isaiah remained in the chair until midnight, afraid that moving might wake the dog or break the fragile peace settling over the room. He had spent years believing that rest had to be earned through forgetting. Ghost had shown him otherwise. Rest came when someone else agreed to keep watch. Near dawn, Isaiah woke to a soft weight against his knee. Ghost had crossed the room during the night and placed his head on Isaiah's leg. The old collar still circled his neck, the brass clasp dull in the gray light. Daniel's identification tag rested against the white fur. Isaiah touched it gently. "One more trip," he said. Ghost opened his eyes. After breakfast, they drove back to the cemetery. The sun rose bright over the pines, burning away the last of the fog. Ghost stood in the passenger seat for most of the ride, alert but calm. He did not pace. He did not whine. When Isaiah opened the truck door, the dog stepped down and waited beside him. They walked through the gate together. Martha saw them from a distance and smiled without calling out. Ghost moved along the familiar path, passing the temporary place where water had once been left beneath the oak. He approached Daniel's grave slowly. The white roses from the service had begun to open, their petals holding small beads of morning dew. Ghost stopped before the stone and read it in the only way he knew, through scent, memory, and the presence of the man standing beside him. Isaiah lowered himself to one knee. "Your name is safe now," he said. Ghost looked at him, then at the collar clasp. Isaiah understood. He unfastened the old leather carefully. Beneath it, the fur was flattened and pale, marked by years of wear. Ghost stood still while Isaiah held the collar in both hands. It had carried Daniel's initials, his hidden tag, his last message, and the promise that neither man nor dog would be left behind. Isaiah placed it at the base of the headstone. The identification tag touched the granite with a small, clear sound. Ghost leaned forward and pressed his nose to the leather. For a long moment, he remained there. Then he stepped back. Isaiah waited for him to lie down. He did not. He expected Ghost to circle the grave. He did not. Instead, the dog turned toward the cemetery gate. He took several steps, paused, and looked over his shoulder. Isaiah rose. "Ready?" Ghost faced forward again. Together, they walked away. Martha watched from beside the office as the old K9 passed her without stopping. His neck looked bare without the collar, but his stride seemed lighter. At the gate, he glanced once toward the far row of stones. Not with panic, not with grief, only recognition. Then he climbed into Isaiah's truck. In the weeks that followed, Ghost learned the quiet rhythms of the house near the river. He slept beside Isaiah's bed when storms rolled in from the coast. He waited by the kitchen each morning while coffee brewed. He followed Isaiah to the porch at sunset, where they watched boats move slowly along the water. Some days, Isaiah spoke about Daniel. Other days, silence was enough. The house changed around them. A second bowl appeared near the door. White fur gathered on the couch Isaiah once kept untouched. The restored photograph moved from the mantel to the table where it could be seen every day. Isaiah began answering calls from former Marines. He began sleeping through the night. Ghost began dreaming with his paws stretched toward the light. They still visited Daniel every Saturday. Isaiah brought fresh flowers. Ghost sat beside the stone, but never again through the night. He stayed only a few minutes, then returned to Isaiah's side before the old Marine called him. Time had taken Daniel's memory, his name, and nearly every road leading home. But one loyal heart had carried what the world misplaced. And when the name was finally restored, Ghost did not abandon his post. He completed it. Then he allowed himself to live,